Hello, Endeavour here. Thomas D'Arcy McGee was born in Carlingford, Ireland on April 13th, 1825. From a young age, he was fascinated with Irish history and folklore. At age 17, he crossed the Atlantic for the first time, settling in Boston, Massachusetts in 1842, where he found a job as an editor of the Boston Pilot, a Catholic newspaper run by the Irish diaspora in New England. McGee made a name for himself writing and delivering speeches in favor of the cause of Irish republicanism. In addition, he advocated for Canada, then a collection of British colonies in North America, to be absorbed into the United States. McGee returned to Ireland in 1845 during the Great Famine. He joined the Young Ireland movement, who championed the cause of Irish nationalism and independence. In 1848, with revolution sweeping across Europe, McGee participated in the Young Ireland Rebellion, which attempted to incite an uprising against British rule in Ireland. When the rebellion failed, McGee was one of several Young Ireland members who were forced to flee the country, sailing back to the United States in October of 1848, where he began to write for the Irish-American publication The Nation in New York City. During the 1850s, McGee underwent a political transformation. The deplorable state of the Irish community in the United States and the widespread anti-Catholic sentiment from the Protestant majority disillusioned McGee with the country, and the ideas of republicanism and classical liberalism more broadly. He took an interest in Canada, seeing it as offering greater potential for the Irish Catholic diaspora. In 1857, he moved to Montreal, Quebec, where he set up a new publication titled New Era. While he continued to advocate for the interests of the Irish Catholic community, politically he turned away from his revolutionary liberal Republican beliefs and embraced monarchism and conservatism. In 1858, McGee was elected to the Legislative Assembly of the Province of Canada, a self-governing crown colony located in present-day Ontario and Quebec. Once a supporter of American annexation of Canada, McGee became an ardent voice for the formation of a new nation through a confederation of Britain's colonies in North America into an independent dominion within the British Empire. He was a representative at the Charlottetown and Quebec conferences in 1864, where the issue of Canadian Confederation was discussed. Following the establishment of the Dominion on July 1, 1867, McGee was elected to the inaugural Canadian Parliament as a member of Prime Minister John A. Macdonald's government. While he played a pivotal role in Canadian Confederation, McGee's political transformation earned him some enemies. Once a radical Republican, McGee now advocated for Ireland to attain self-governance within the British Empire as Canada had. His repudiation of the Republican cause and denunciation of the Fenian Brotherhood, an American-based Irish nationalist group which advocated an American conquest of Canada, weakened his support within the Irish Catholic community. Many of them now considered him a traitor. On April 7, 1868, while walking home after attending a parliamentary debate in Ottawa, McGee was shot and killed. After a trial which remains controversial to this day, Patrick J. Whelan, an Irish immigrant and Fenian Brotherhood sympathizer, was convicted and subsequently hanged for his murder. McGee was given the first state funeral in Canadian history in Ottawa. A few days later, a crowd of 80,000 turned out for his procession in Montreal to mourn his death on April 13th, which would have been his 43rd birthday. As a Canadian, I consider Thomas D'Arcy McGee one of our country's national heroes. The crest of the Canadian Red Ensign is a shield featuring the emblems of the 4 European nations from which Canada's founding settlers derived their ancestry: England, France, Scotland, and Ireland. I can think of no greater representative of the Irish quadrant of our emblem than Thomas D'Arcy McGee. As a historian, poet, journalist, statesman, and master orator, McGee was the epitome of Victorian excellence. He had a raging fire in his belly and an unquenchable thirst for knowledge. Not only did this bring him back and forth across the Atlantic, placing him at the forefront of all the great political struggles of his time, but it also sent him on an equally substantial intellectual journey. This culminated in McGee becoming one of the architects of Canadian nationhood, a defender of the Canadian tradition of loyalism, and a visionary for the Dominion's founding creed of peace, order, and good government. His incredible life left him with a legacy as one of Canada's most remarkable fathers of Confederation, though not everyone saw him in such a positive light. McGee remained a devout Catholic throughout his life and earnestly stood for what he believed to be in the best interests of his fellow Irishmen. However, his change of heart on the Republican cause cast him as a traitor in the eyes of many Irishmen, one of whom went so far as to assassinate him for it. Under Canada's national meta-narrative, Thomas D'Arcy McGee is a national hero who was tragically taken from us too soon. Though when considering the national meta-narrative of his native Ireland, his role in the story is very different. Ireland's foundational myth is a tale of a centuries-long struggle against tyrannical British rule, culminating in the achievement of home rule through war and subsequently the establishment of the Republic of Ireland in the 20th century. In this story, Magee doesn't exactly play the role of a hero. While I would argue that even though his beliefs changed over time, he always stood for what he genuinely believed to be best for Ireland, I could understand why an Irishman would have a less positive view of a figure like Magee than I do as a Canadian. However, to ask if we could objectively say if Thomas D'Arcy Magee was a hero or a villain would be to have a misguided understanding of the concept of heroism. Heroes are not shared universally, but revered by those on behalf of whom their heroic acts were done. They fit within a meta-narrative which forms the consciousness of a particular group of people. This often puts them at odds with the meta-narratives of different groups of people. Traditionally, a hero is understood to be someone who made extraordinary contributions towards their tribal collective. In the Iliad, the protagonist Achilles is a hero for his legendary might displayed in battle. However, it's important to understand that Achilles' heroism was not universal. He was a hero of the Greeks because that's on whose side he fought. From the perspective of the Trojans who he fought against, Achilles was a menace. Their hero was Hector, the greatest warrior of Troy, who fought against the Greeks in defense of his own people. I can think of plenty figures from Canadian history who I would consider heroes of our nation, but the number of entries on that list would decline considerably within the past 80 years of our history. While there are a few figures from this era who I admire, I can't think of anyone worthy of the title of national hero who actually held political power in the present era. This isn't exclusive to my country either. From the perspective of other Western countries such as the United States, Britain, or Germany, I would also struggle to think of any truly heroic figures from their recent history who led their countries. Why is it that heroes in the West seem like a thing of the past? In the post-war era, the West adopted a philosophy of universalist egalitarian liberalism. The concept of nationhood as defined by shared ancestry was replaced by one defined by a set of liberal civic values, which could be applied universally. This made it so that it was no longer considered heroic to fight for one's people against their enemies, but rather to fight on behalf of this universalist egalitarian liberal doctrine. Once this new consensus was brought to its logical conclusion, the legacy of numerous once renowned figures was brought into question. Robert E. Lee was once celebrated in the American South as a war hero, and in the United States more broadly as an embodiment of military brilliance and gentlemanliness. Today, he is denounced as an oppressor who fought on behalf of slavery and white supremacy. James Cook was once honored across the Anglosphere as a brilliant explorer who made countless contributions to scientific advancement and paved the way for Britain's expansion into lands ranging from North America to Oceania. Today, he is condemned as a colonialist who was complicit in the supposed genocide of indigenous people. The moral indictment levied against Lee, Cook, and every other heroic figure who was once admired in the West is that they were so-called racists. In the post-war era, the crime of racism was established as the greatest of all sins against the new universalist egalitarian morality. This is derived from the foundational myth of World War II. The meta-narrative of the post-war era is that the ultimate evil of the racist and anti-Semitic axis was defeated by the ultimate good of the egalitarian universalist liberal allies. This is how World War II is portrayed as a heroic struggle under this moral framework. However, it only takes a little scrutiny to see how ahistoric this narrative really is. I'll use Canada as an example to illustrate this. In the 1940s, Canada was an ethno-state. The Prime Minister at the time, William Lyon Mackenzie King, explicitly stated on many occasions during his career that he considered Canada to be a white nation. During his time in office, Canada's immigration policy favored immigrants from the British Isles, and King enacted numerous laws to restrict immigration from places like Asia, all on the impetus of maintaining ethnic homogeneity. King's government also denied Jewish refugees entry into Canada, further discrediting the idea that Canada fought World War II to stop anti-Semitism. After visiting Germany in 1937, King had some criticisms, but he also had many positive things to say about the country. It's also worth noting that King wasn't considered far-right for his time. He was the leader of the Liberal Party. His stance on these issues were just the norm. In truth, Canada was no less quote-unquote racist than National Socialist Germany during this era. The conception of Canada held by Canadian soldiers who fought in World War II was that of a European-derived nation, which belonged to them, and this is what they were fighting on behalf of. Whether or not the war actually served these interests is another question entirely. Regardless of how I may feel towards that question, I still consider the valor of Canadian soldiers shown at Juno Beach or Hong Kong heroic. However, the narrative that this was done on behalf of democracy and universal human rights is false. For a time, it was common for the political establishment to try to shoehorn admired figures from the past into this same lens. Someone like Abraham Lincoln, for example, was celebrated under this paradigm as the president who abolished slavery in the United States. While Abraham Lincoln was an abolitionist, it is incorrect to interpret his motivation as a modern universal conception of human rights. Lincoln thought of the United States as a white country and stated explicitly that he did not believe an egalitarian multiracial society would work. In fact, he showed support for the American Colonization Society, who advocated resettling freed African American slaves in Liberia with the goal of avoiding this. In the 2020s, many of these white figures, such as Abraham Lincoln or Winston Churchill, who had previously been retconned into symbols of the post-war consensus, have now also been demonized as racists, along with every other figure from Western history. While I disagree that not lining up with the current zeitgeist makes them irredeemably evil people, it is true that this is a more accurate interpretation of these individuals than superimposing the values of the post-war era onto them. In addition to the myth of World War II as the so-called Good War, today we are also force-fed the idea that we should regard people like Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Mahatma Gandhi, Anne Frank, and Albert Einstein as heroes. Rather than being revered for exceptional deeds as warriors, statesmen, or pioneers, these individuals are deemed heroes for their purported victimhood status at the hands of Europeans, except for Einstein, who was also renowned for his scientific contributions. This has resulted in our culture venerating weakness and demonizing strength, which in turn has established victimhood as the highest indicator of virtue under the dominant morality in the West. These individuals are upheld as virtuous for their contributions to the advancement of the universalist egalitarian creed which currently dominates the West. In reality, an analysis of any of these figures will show that they were simply ethnic activists pursuing their own group interests, possibly with the exception of Anne Frank since she was only 15 when she died. The appeals these individuals made to egalitarianism and universalism were simply strategic ploys to gain the sympathy of Europeans in order to advance their own respective causes. They didn't genuinely believe in any of these values, as evidenced by the movements which they spawned, such as BLM, the ANC, Indian nationalism, and Zionism, all of which are proudly ethnocentric and have abandoned any appeals to universalism. The supposed heroism which these now adorned figures are alleged to have carried out is that they promoted their own group interests in opposition to those of Europeans, the thing which the post-war creed axiomatically declares the greatest evil. Furthermore, this wasn't achieved through conquest, but through deceptively appealing to a sense of fairness and compassion in Europeans, which they had no intentions of reciprocating. Probably the most influential portrayals of heroism in pop culture during this era have been comic book superheroes. These fictional characters do embody some heroic virtues. They are portrayed as having extraordinary strength, placing them above the average mortal. However, they typically are not portrayed as being heroes on behalf of a specific group whom they are loyal to, but the universal good of all of humanity. The storylines of comic book heroes such as Spider-Man, Superman, and Batman are typically set in major metropolitan areas such as New York City, and their adversaries are usually one-dimensionally evil foes purely motivated by self-interest. This has served to reinforce the idea that heroism is universalist, that heroes are selfless defenders of all mankind rather than their own kind. The phrase cartoonishly evil exists because in the real world, one's enemies usually don't resemble a villain from a Saturday morning cartoon. They are often simply representatives of the interests of their own group, and you oppose them out of loyalty to yours. Batman stopping the Joker from blowing up Gotham just to see it burn would universally be recognized as good. But would Batman fight alongside Theodore Roosevelt in Cuba during the Spanish-American War? That would mean his heroism would not be universal, but specific to his country, the United States. It's also worth noting that almost every single iconic comic book hero in pop culture today was written by Jewish authors in the United States in the 20th century. As a result, undertones of Jewish angst in American society were regularly infused into these stories. For example, the character Superman, a creation of Jewish comic creators Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, is an alien who blends in with humanity but continues to feel like an outsider due to his exceptionality. This is a not very subtle allegory for how Jews see themselves in American society. It's noteworthy that the story places the social outsider in the role of the hero in contrast to traditional tales where the hero is firmly established in the society he is part of. X-Men, which was written by Jewish comic creators Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, is a story of a team of mutants whose mutations grant them superhuman powers, but also result in their ostracization from society. The overarching theme of X-Men is the veneration of otherness. The mutants are portrayed as victims, yet morally superior to mainstream society. The X-Men have been likened to outsiders in the United States, such as Jews, blacks, or homosexuals, and the story is a parable for the dominant egalitarian universalist morality of the present. Even Captain America, a comic book hero who ostensibly represents the traditional heroic virtue of patriotism, was in fact a subversion of it. The character was originally written in 1940 by Jewish comic creators Joe Simon and Jack Kirby as propaganda designed to encourage the American public to support the United States entering World War II, something which the majority of Americans opposed at the time. The character also served as an early purveyor of the contemporary myths surrounding World War II. This is why, despite the guise of patriotism, it's difficult to imagine Captain America fighting alongside General Winfield Scott in the Mexican-American War. While these works of fiction preach universalism, under the surface they are laced with the meta-narratives of a particular foreign group. The conception of heroism in the West today exalts weakness over strength and devotion to a vague, universal humanity over allegiance to one's own people. This totally contradicts how heroism was conceived of in eras prior. As a result, the West no longer has heroes today. This is why the establishment today can do nothing but desperately milk the dried-up cow of the post-war consensus a little more in an attempt to conjure an ounce of inspiration in the public. They're stuck with perpetually rehashing World War II, fear-mongering about the return of fascism, wheeling out the same handful of supposedly inspirational figures from the mid to late 20th century to depreciating effect, and creating infinite remakes of the pop culture of that era. Not only do we have no heroes today, but also attempts at manufacturing new ones consistently fall flat. Despite efforts at establishing individuals like Barack Obama, Angela Merkel, or Greta Thunberg as symbols of reverence, none are widely celebrated today. No matter how much the establishment tries to sell them as inspirational, the vapid liberal managerialist globalism they represent is incapable of stirring the human soul the same way mighty rulers, fearsome warriors, and courageous adventurers did in centuries past. Beyond the universalist egalitarian premises through which virtue is judged in the West today being based on lies, these values aren't even pursued in earnest. European particularism is vilified under the pretension of these principles, but in reality, this is done in order to serve the particularist interests of other groups whose interests conflict with ours. The reason Westerners no longer have any figures worthy of celebration is because we are living in the meta-narratives of other peoples in which we are cast as villains. There's a 40-meter-tall statue of Genghis Khan standing in Mongolia today, erected in 2008 to commemorate the 800th anniversary of the founding of the Mongol Empire. If he had been European, we would be taught that Genghis Khan was the most evil man ever to exist. However, within the national meta-narrative of Mongolians, who are not hampered by the same debilitating guilt and self-doubt as Westerners, he is celebrated as a legendary conqueror and the founder of their nation. What others might think of Genghis Khan is irrelevant. He is a hero of Mongolia, and that is all that matters to them. What the accusation of racism, which is recognized as the ultimate sin in the West today, really denotes is European particularism. When formerly celebrated figures in the West are derided as racists today, the supposed crime they are accused of having committed is that they were loyal to their own people first and foremost. Prior to this corrupt era in which we are living, loyalty to one's own had been understood as virtuous. Our moral code being twisted to the point that our society now sees a virtue in treason is why we no longer have heroes. My heroes are men like James Wolfe, James Cook, Isaac Brock, John A. Macdonald, William Lyon Mackenzie King, and Thomas D'Arcy McGee. I reject the idea pushed today that they shouldn't be celebrated in Canada but denounced as so-called white supremacist settler colonialists. Not only that, but I also refuse to try to shoehorn them into the framework of this universalist egalitarian ideology. I won't claim that King was an anti-fascist or that McGee was a minority rights activist. These are distortions of the truth designed to obfuscate what actually made them heroic. When these men are labeled colonialists and racists today, what those levying this condemnation really mean is that they fought, built, and ruled on behalf of us. Before this delusional and malevolent worldview took over the West in the past few decades, this was the standard through which soldiers, pioneers, and statesmen were proclaimed heroes. And it won't be until we cast off this disease of the soul and return to a natural and healthy moral order that we will have heroes again. The following is the poem False Fear of the World by Thomas D'Arcy McGee from the YouTube channel Canada the Unknown Country.
The world, why plague it, man? Why do you shake your world at me? For all its years and all your fear, the thing I am I still must be. I see, fine homes on hills, with winding pathways smooth and fair. But let me moil among the mills, rather than creep to riches there. A heather bell on Travail's cliffs smells sweeter than the garden rose. The lumber barge outsails the skiffs and saves men's lives when Boreas blows. Sure, it's enough to note the day with morning hail and night adieu, nor squander precious hours away with affectation's empty crew. My friend's my friend, my foe is my foe. I have my hours of joy and gloom. I do not love all mankind, no. The heart I have has not the room. But there is half a score I know, and her and you, and this wee thing, who make my world, my all below. Cause. Constitution. Country. King.
If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. You can follow me on X or Telegram, and I also publish exclusive content on Substack. If you'd like to make a donation, Substack will be the place to do that. All links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.